together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that, we having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Be seated, please. Yes, Honourable Howe now resume his sitting. Call of the roll.
Mr. Whittle, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Holness, Dr. Clarke, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Darrell Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Malahoo Fort, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Green, Mr. Terry Long, Mr. Montague, Mr. Main, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Azan, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown-Burke, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Mr. Clarke, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Dr. Matt Neal, Ms. Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Michael Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Wright. Anybody?
Statements by ministers.
Mr. Speaker, as is well known and understood, today the Minister of Finance will table the third supplementary estimate, and he will also continue to close the debate on the appropriations bill. In addition, Mr. Speaker, it is my intention at a later stage to give notice of the sectoral debate when it will commence, and also the question of the presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. I will deal with the matter of the Human Employment and Resource Training Amendment Act 2019. That is our agenda for the day, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have to inquire, in light of the news today from the Prime Minister that a minister has resigned, whether or not we should anticipate a statement in the Parliament. I certainly am anticipating a statement from the Prime Minister on this issue as it affects this important ministry at this important time, and it is usually reported to the Parliament. Normally it's the leader of government business who would report who has changed portfolio assignment. But I want to know whether or not there's going to be a statement today as it is expected by the country.
Mr. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not so aware, Mr. Speaker. I've not been made aware of that at this time. However, the Prime Minister will be attending Parliament today, and it is undoubtedly his intention to apprise the government and the people of Jamaica on exactly what measures will be undertaken by him to lead and continue the work of the Ministry of Education at the highest efficiency level.
Announcements. Let me take this opportunity to welcome a number of visitors in the gallery, friends, family and officials, the Minister. We welcome you to Parliament today. I hope you enjoy yourself. Yesterday we had a number of cell phones going off, I would say ringing in the gallery. You might have been advised when you come in that you should put your cell phone on silent, and you can text, but we do not permit answering and dialing phone in the gallery or in the Parliament. Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips.
Mr. Speaker, in relation to the other matter, as the House Leader had indicated.
1 minute, please. The matter that has been brought by the Leader of Opposition Business is not for debate.
I'm not seeking a debate.
1 minute. Just have a seat, Dr. Phillips, please. When the Prime Minister arrives, if he wishes to make a statement, we'll suspend the standing order and so too. When he arrives, if it doesn't happen, then you can seek permission and proceed to have it. We do not want a debate on a matter that is not up for debate. I would be happy if you would.
Respect. I sought no debate. There is, but it is usual form, as has been indicated, that the House is notified of changes made. In this particular instance, and I am seeking to have the advice provided by the House Leader in the absence of the Prime Minister. The Constitution requires that not less than 2 nor more than 4 ministers be from the Senate. My understanding is that the minister who has
Dr. Phillips.
Mr. Speaker, I would like
Dr.
to
Phillips.
inquire. I would like to inquire whether or not the constitutional provisions
Dr. Phillips, you are
to your
the
knowledge,
leader
and
of
could
your
you
position.
tell
I am calling
Mr.
you.
Speaker,
I am calling you, Dr.
Mr.
Phillips.
Speaker, I quite frankly
I am
find
asking
your
you to
interruptions to be unparliamentary and disrespectful to the Parliament.
I have a... Dr. Phillips, I will not allow a debate on a matter of this. When the Prime Minister arrives, you can say all you want. I'm not going to accommodate any debate until he comes.
Mr. Speaker, every one of us came to this Parliament by the same route. Our constituents sent us here. And the role of the chair is to allow the Parliament to function, not for the chair to operate on the basis that it is in
Dr. Phillips,
protection
I
of the
am
government.
well aware of the role of the Speaker. You and your side have outlined it and handed it to me. And it says, I am not going to accommodate a debate on a matter that is not in a motion or has been put out by your side. When the Prime Minister comes, there will be ample time to say what you want to say. So I'm going to ask that we proceed.
You again, we are not seeking a debate. I inquired for some information, as is my right.
And you have been so advised by the Leader of Government Business. Bills brought from the Senate. Sorry, announcements. Order, please. Order, please.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following. Ministry Papers numbers 15 through 18, entitled Cabinet Agenda Issues dated January 14 and 23, 2019, and February 4 and 11, 2019. Jamaica Third Supplementary Estimates 2018 to 2019 from the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service.
Bills brought from the Senate. Petitions. Papers. Members, if you are not participating in the Parliament in the proper way, we are going to have some difficulty. I'm going to ask both sides, particularly ministers, to lead the right way in the standing orders. Reports from committees. Notices of motion given orally. Reports from committees. Notices of motion given orally.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of National Security, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, he will move the following resolution. Be it resolved that this Honourable House of Representatives approve the plans and programs being pursued by the government in respect of ministries which were not included in the debate on the appropriations bill, and further approve the policy projections as announced by the financial year for the financial year 2019-2020.
Quick.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Be it resolved that the third supplementary estimates for the financial year ended March 31st, 2019, which was laid on the table of the House on the 20th day of March 2019, be referred to the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee of the House of Representatives for consideration and report. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion.
Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained.
Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Human Employment and Resource Training Amendment Act 2019.
A bill shortly entitled the Human Employment Resource Training Amendment Act 2019, read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill.
Minister Williams.
Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Information and Communications Technology Authority Act 2019.
A bill shortly entitled the Information and Communications Technology Authority Act 2019, read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill.
Public business.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion over which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I now move, be it resolved that the third supplementary estimates of expenditure for the year ending March 31st, 2019, which was laid on the table of the House on the 20th day of March 2019, be referred to the Public Administration and Appropriation Committee of the House of Representatives for consideration and report.
Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Dr. Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the chairman of the PAC with whom I've had discussions, and to the members of the PAC who will convene to consider these third supplementary estimates on Tuesday, the 26th of March, and for the House Finance Committee or the Standing Finance Committee of the House to consider them later on that day. Mr. Speaker, I now ask that with respect to the Appropriation Act 2019, that we conclude debate on the bill and then ask that it be read a second time.
Dr. Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to give the closing contribution to the debate on appropriation bill for 2019. I once again, Mr. Speaker, thank the staff of the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service and for the agencies in the Ministry of the Public Service for their commitment and dedication to their jobs and for the excellence in the performance of their duties. I thank the advisory and administrative staff in my office, and I thank those from my constituency who are here to support, and others who we work with at the Ministry of Finance. Thanks to the Prime Minister, to the Leader of the Opposition, and to the Opposition spokesperson on finance for their contributions to the 2019-2020 budget. We learned during the course of that budget debate that the opposition spokesman on finance has missed his calling. He deserves a recording contract under the name of Marky G. My advice, however, is that he should stick to the singing. Thanks to the members of Parliament on both sides of the aisle for your participation, even if some of the forms of expression are at variance with the wishes of the Speaker. Thanks to the Speaker, a trade union leader, a former Minister of Government, a living legend who continues to serve Jamaica with distinction. Thank you for the Thank you for the way in which you presided over these debates. I have a feeling I might need your help today. No. Huh? No. I'm just Thanks once again to the outstanding parliamentary staff for your usual professional service. Thanks to members of the media and civil society for your participation in this debate and for making your voices heard in print, social, and electronic media. My presentation in this closing budget presentation will begin with a summary of the budget, followed by addressing certain inaccuracies which I'll characterize as misguided from the opposition, addressing other comments, incorporation of some of the suggestions made, and I'll end with some concluding remarks. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is fortunate to have a robust and vibrant democracy. Our democracy is not simply electoral in nature, characterized by free and fair elections. Our electoral democracy is complemented with the institutions of a free media, an independent judiciary, and a custom of abiding by the rule of law. This collection of institutions has provided Jamaica with a liberal democracy that is one of our most valued inheritances. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is one of very few countries in the world which, over the last 75 years, has had an unbroken record of continuous democratic elections under universal adult suffrage, and at the same time, over those 75 years, having liberal institutions of a free media and an independent judiciary, and over those 75 years, having no coups, juntas, dictatorships, or anything, not even attempts of that kind. We belong, Mr. Speaker, to a very, very special and small group of no more than 20 countries out of 200 in the world who can make those simultaneous claims over the last 75 years. For Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, for example, has had unbroken universal adult suffrage decades ahead of Australia and Brazil, Canada and Chile, Colombia, India, Japan, Portugal, Switzerland, Spain, and many, many other countries. Yet, Mr. Speaker, the world does not have many examples of countries that have traversed the entire route from developing to developed using an exclusively liberal democratic political architecture. most of the countries that have experienced economic transition to developed status have had illiberal regimes of one kind or another for at least part of their journey. I say this to say, Mr. Speaker, that for Jamaica to be among the first countries to make this transition from developing to developed status with an exclusively liberal democratic model, then liberal democracy on autopilot is insufficient. Instead, we have to be conscious at all times of our rich inheritance of liberal democracy, but also of how easy it is to employ this marvelous gift for purposes other than economic and social development. Like many tools, liberal democracy holds the seeds of its own subversion, as the institutions and practices that make liberal democracy the most attractive political ideology for government can easily be, and sometimes are, undermined in the interest of political parties and other special interest groups. We must commit ourselves to ensuring that our precious liberal democracy will be deployed to serving Jamaica's interests and the interests of all its people, and not simply the interests of political parties and special groups. Mr. Speaker, this requires vigilant self-consciousness among all of us, myself included, that regardless of which side of the political aisle we are on, our competition in the democratic space should always be focused on empowering, on leading to advances and not reversals. Otherwise, we run the risk of subverting and squandering our liberal democratic inheritance for short-term partisan political gain. Mr. Speaker, it is my hope that all of us in this Honourable House will recommit ourselves on a periodic basis to ensuring that we rise above the political fray and keep our eyes gazed and firmly focused on the central objective of uplifting and advancing the development of all Jamaicans. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is experiencing the best economic times of any period in the last 50 years. Mr. Speaker, things are by no means perfect, as the Prime Minister said yesterday, but based on objective data, we have not had this alignment of economic variables in 50 years. Indulge me to repeat a summary of the variables I pointed to in my budget presentation. We have had low and stable inflation for 4 years, and among the lowest inflation rates in our history as an independent country. Domestic interest rates are at levels never seen before in Jamaica and will head lower with the changes introduced in this budget. Jamaica has enjoyed 15 consecutive quarters of economic growth, and based on PIOJ forecasts, this record is set to stretch to 16, which is the longest unbroken stretch of quarterly economic growth since we started measuring growth quarterly in 1997. Jamaica's debt to GDP at 96% is the lowest it has been in almost 20 years. Our credit rating at the highest level in 10 years, and our growth rate projected of 1.9% for this year, though it leaves room for improvement, represents the highest growth rate Jamaica has experienced in 12 years. We have more people employed in Jamaica today than at any point in our history. And our contract with you is that we will manage the economy in a way that encourages investment and expansion that delivers jobs for the people of Jamaica. I have said it before, and I will say it again. Jamaica is moving in the right direction. It is in this context that I presented a budget that emphasized the simultaneous pursuit of economic independence, economic opportunity for all, and protection of the vulnerable. And it's in the context of these three policy pillars that this government is set on delivering growth with equity. I presented the case, Mr. Speaker, that we have the capacity and the duty to pursue both objectives simultaneously because the achievement of one directly reinforces the prospects for achieving the other. I will quickly summarize, Mr. Speaker, the main features of the 1920 budget. I outlined our strategy of protecting the vulnerable with a substantial increase in our major social safety net programs from $16 billion this year to $20 billion in 2019-20, an increase of 25%. This larger allocation increases PATH cash grants by 16%, PATH examination support by 50%, PATH transportation, which now includes children at the early childhood level, a massive increase of 90%. Mr. Speaker, the cumulative increases in allocation to school transportation and school feeding since this government came to office is over 70% to date. And the cumulative increases in cash grants to help the most needy in our society has increased since this government came to office by between 45 and 55%. We have allocated $558 million to the Poverty Reduction Program, an increase of 174%. Mr. Speaker, we are funding an innovative social housing program to upgrade tenement yards and provide housing for the indigent, and we have allocated the substantial amount of $1 billion. So, Marty G, you can tell the children that Santa is coming to the ghetto. See him there, Santa Samuda. We are funding a targeted program to upgrade sanitation, water, and electricity infrastructure in several economically and socially volatile communities and allocated more than $2 billion, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, national security is of universal concern to every Jamaican. We have allocated the largest capital budget for national security in Jamaica's history, a total of $20 billion, an increase of 62% or $7.5 billion over last year. And this increased expenditure will fund renovation of 60 police stations for $1 billion. The Prime Minister spoke yesterday, a renovation of another 100 police stations through NHT, $1.8 billion for 1,000 police cars, $11.8 billion to protect our borders. Mr. Speaker, this substantial increase on security means more mobility, more patrols, more efficiency, less opportunity for criminals, and a safer society for our people. Mr. Speaker, there are also considerable increases for rural infrastructure. Agriculture is the lifeline of rural Jamaica. When agriculture grows, Jamaica grows. Mr. Speaker, there's a direct link between agricultural vitality and reduction in poverty levels. So, Marky G, Santa is not just going to the ghetto. Santa coming country too. See him there? Santa Shaw, Santa Hutchinson. As a result, Mr. Speaker, as a result, Mr. Speaker, we have allocated $800 million approximately to rural water, which is 8 times more than we allocated this year. For 280 storage tanks, drainage, guttering, water will transform those communities. $750 million to rehabilitate 1,000 kilometers of rural farm roads, which will increase the efficiency of the supply chain. $1.1 billion to irrigation in Essex Valley and Pedro Plains. Mr. Speaker, the budget also includes projects designed to bring forward this new and modern Jamaica we all want. Among these include the work towards a new Parliament building, a new recreational park for the parish of St. James, and the 110-kilometer South Coast Highway project. The budget introduces measures for the first time designed to stimulate innovation, including direct budgetary support for research and development at the tertiary level, and a new $200 million sidecar fund to finance early-stage angel co-investing. For decades, Mr. Speaker, payments on student loans were applied to penalties and interest first, and then to outstanding balances. This made it difficult for students and past students to service loans. With the stroke of a pen, Mr. Speaker, no fiscal space required, we are changing that. Going forward, payments on new student loans will be applied first to the most outstanding payment. Mr. Speaker, we lowered the interest rates on student loans and provided for loan principal reductions for people working full-time who are working in registered charities in good standing. This will provide necessary financial relief to those past students. We are working to broaden the ownership base of the economy. And as the Prime Minister mentioned in his budget speech, we'll be offering the opportunity to own pieces of Jamaica by using the Jamaica Stock Exchange as an avenue through which Wigton will be privatized, the Jamaica Public Service Company will be privatized, and the Jamaica Mortgage Bank will be privatized. These IPOs will be bottom-up distribution, ensuring that all small applications are filled before allocations made in favor of larger applications. The budget places, all small will be filled before large allocations, and you have tiers. The budget places emphasis on micro, small, and medium-sized businesses, providing approximately $2 billion of funding for these entities, with $500 million devoted to micro entities with sales less than $10 million. As the Prime Minister stated in his budget presentation, Mr. Speaker, this government is greatly expanding access to housing, reducing interest rates for the 115,000 loan customers of the NHT, and another several thousand who access NHT benefits through building societies. This will provide necessary financial relief to all of these NHT customers. As the Prime Minister announced, the interest rate qualification bands will be expanded, and now you can get a 0% mortgage if you make $15,000 a week or less. The budget increases the amount the NHT can borrow from $5.5 to $6.5 million. And for the first time in history, the intergenerational mortgage will become a reality, expanding the possibility for home ownership to many at the base of society. Mr. Speaker, the 2019-20 budget and 2019-20 year is one that represents economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, it is in that context that the tax cuts are being made. The tax give back does not literally give cash back, but rather it removes taxes that distort and stop and obstruct transactions and business activity. Small and medium-sized businesses employ the most people in Jamaica and account for the vast majority of transactions in Jamaica. Jamaica prospers when small business prospers, and the revenue measures are designed, in part, to relieve small business of some of the distortionary tax-related costs. As such, Mr. Speaker, the minimum business tax and the asset tax for non-financial businesses are being abolished. We need to rekindle domestic economic business and transaction activity if we are to elevate domestic value added and growth. By reducing the cost of transactions, the government is empowering individuals and firms to transact, which positively impacts growth. The measures also empower individuals and firms to seek the best possible financial terms for previous transactions and financial contracts, whether it be a mortgage or a car loan or a furniture loan, equipment loan or a business loan. And this, Mr. Speaker, will allow the individual or the company to manage their liabilities in a way that releases financial resources that they can use in other ways. Now, Mr. Speaker, turn my attention to addressing certain inaccuracies and misguided statements from the opposition, of which there are quite a few. That in my capacity as Minister of Finance and the Public Service, I am compelled to correct. Mr. Speaker, I don't intend to be hostile. However, these claims and assertions need to be addressed, and it's my job to do so. Had these claims and assertions not been made by the opposition, I would have no need for this entire section of my speech. Mr. Speaker, one of the more unfortunate assertions in the presentation of the opposition spokesman on finance was to challenge the fact that Jamaica has had 15 unbroken consecutive quarters of economic growth, soon to be 16 if PIOJ projections prove accurate. To paraphrase the famous quotation, the opposition spokesman is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own set of facts. Here is a report from Statin, Mr. Speaker. Here it is, there it is, you can see it. Quarterly gross domestic product report, September 2018. That shows 15 consecutive quarters of economic growth along with the rate of growth for each quarter on page 14. Now bring it up. If you can read it, Mr. Speaker, let us count. Quarter 3, 2018, 1. Quarter 2, 2018, 2. Quarter 1, 2018, 3. Quarter 4, 2017, 4. All of them, 5, 6, 7, all the way. 15 consecutive quarters of economic growth. The member is entitled to his opinion, but not his own set of facts. Mr. Speaker, this is the longest period of quarterly economic growth that Jamaica has experienced since we started measuring growth in 1997. That is another fact. I suspect that those who assisted the opposition spokesman in the presentation of his, they looked at it's a miss, you didn't use the right table, Marky G. Here's the thing, Marky G, here's it. You looked at quarter-over-quarter growth, which has seasonal effects rather than year-over-year, which overcomes distortions. You see, Mr. Speaker, when you compare the fourth quarter in any year with the third quarter in any year, 8 or 9 times out of 10, Q4 is less than Q3 because Q3 includes the month of December, which has tons of transactions, usually. And that's what it is described as a seasonal trend. As a result, when we talk about quarterly growth, we're interested in quarter 4 GDP growth this year compared with quarter 4 GDP growth last year. And we're interested in quarter 3 GDP growth this year compared with quarter 3 GDP growth last year. This is year-over-year quarterly growth, which evens out seasonalities. If you wanted to be technically precise, you would say 15 consecutive quarters of year-over-year economic growth, the longest such stretch since 1997. However, dropping the year-over-year is customarily taken to be the equivalent statement. So, Marky G, stick with the singing. The opposition spokesman spent time advancing a narrative that the growth outturn in the current period is less than was originally forecast in 2013. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is technically accurate. But what the opposition spokesman conveniently did not mention is that the growth projections made in 2013 for 2014, just a year later, and for 2015, just 2 years later, underperformed much more significantly. The projected 2014 was 1.4%. Do you know what the actual performance was? 0.2%. The projected growth in 2015 was 1.8%. You know what the performance was? 1%. Growth thrives on momentum. So if you did not meet your own 2013 projections in 2014, and you did not meet your own 2013 projections in 2015, Do you magically expect that those same 2013 projections are going to be met in 2016? And Mr. Speaker, 4 years after. And Mr. Speaker, I mentioned this in the context of the prior administration's track record of underperforming with respect to capital expenditure, which is one of the key influencers of growth, future growth outcomes. Let me remind this House that when the last administration entered into the extended fund facility with the IMF, they forecasted capital expenditure of $41 billion in 2013-14. What was the actual capital expenditure? $37 billion, almost 10% less than budgeted. In 2014-15, they forecasted capital expenditure of $54 billion. Do you know what the actual capital expenditure was? It was $23 billion, or 57% less than budgeted, less than half. Mr. Speaker, they forecasted capital expenditure of $71 billion in 2015-16. What was the actual expenditure? $33 billion, almost 40% less than budgeted. Now you understand what the Prime Minister was saying yesterday with the South Coast Highway, all right? No, Mr. Speaker. In the same 2013 agreement, they forecasted total capex of $166 billion for 2013-14, 14-15, and 15-16 combined, and they managed to do 44% less than budgeted. Now, we all know that capital expenditure today promotes growth tomorrow. What impact do you expect in subsequent years vis-a-vis your contemporaneous projections if you consistently fail to execute on capital expenditure targets? I am talking about 2016. So compare that, Mr. Speaker, compare that with the execution against capital expenditure targets under the Andrew Holness government. With our 2016 program, they like to pretend it's theirs. With our 2016 program with the fund. Mr. Speaker, when we designed our own program in November of 2016, we forecasted capital expenditure of $43 billion in 2016-17. We executed 42, 98% of the forecast. In the same 2016 IMF agreement, we forecasted capital expenditure of $45 billion in 2017-18, and we surpassed it, executing $47 billion. In the same 2016 IMF agreement, our agreement, we forecasted capital expenditure of $55 billion in 2018-19, and we have already passed it, and the year not done yet. The year not done yet. We have a supplementary. We are at $64 billion. We forecasted $55 billion. An overperformance of 20%, Mr. Speaker. Instead of underperforming on the critical area of capital expenditure like many previous administrations, we are overperforming with respect to capital expenditure, which is critical to providing the support for economic growth. So when you hear us talk about capital expenditure, it is because we have put a great effort in that area, and we have good results to show. Now come bad behind us feet. We have made capital expenditure a priority. Our overperformance did not happen by accident. At the end of the first quarter of this year, I was on record telling anybody who would listen that for the first time in nearly 12 years, we were running ahead of our capital expenditure targets after Q1, and I believe after Q2 as well. So, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, it is interesting how the opposition leader and the opposition spokesman seem to have an insatiable desire to claim credit and deny the unmistakable contributions of others. And I have to mention it, Mr. Speaker, in light of the presentations. The logic escapes me in light of the overwhelming public evidence to the contrary. The Prime Minister touched on it yesterday, but allow me to ask a few simple questions. Where would Jamaica be, and what would the fiscal accounts of Jamaica been like if the Bruce Golding administration had not divested Air Jamaica, which had accumulated approximately $1.5 billion in debt and was losing billions annually? Where would Jamaica be, and what would the fiscal accounts of Jamaica be like if the Bruce Golding administration had not divested 5 loss-making sugar factories that were losing billions on an annual basis? Mr. Speaker, where would Jamaica be, and what would the fiscal accounts of Jamaica be like if the Honourable Aldershot had not conceptualized, negotiated, and successfully completed the first ever debt exchange, which many critics say couldn't work? Where would Jamaica be, and what would our fiscal accounts be like if the Honourable Aldershot did not discontinue the disastrous policy of avoiding cheaper multilateral loans in favor of higher market credit? And where would Jamaica be? What would the fiscal accounts of Jamaica be if the Bruce Golding administration had not turned to the IMF and begun the structural adjustment program? Where did the public sector reform? Where did the public sector reform gestate, if not in the Public Sector Rationalization Report Commission, commissioned and completed under the Bruce Golding administration? How would public pension reform, so crucial to fiscal sustainability, have been achieved if it did not have a beginning? We're not denying that, but it had a beginning. Mr. Speaker, how would the reform of the Bank of Jamaica accomplished in 2014 and 2015 be achieved if it did not begin at some point? I served on the board of the BOJ, and I can attest to the fact that the policy began under the 2010 IMF standby agreement. The fiscal responsibility framework also began under the Bruce Golding administration, which was strengthened under the Simpson-Miller administration, and hopefully we can work together to strengthen it further.
Dr. Clarke, your time for speaking has expired. The Leader of Government Business will see to an extension.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the member's time be extended sufficient to enable him to complete his presidency.
Those in favour? Those against? As Dr. Clarke.
No, Mr. Speaker, it is an undeniable fact that the 2010 IMF agreement collapsed, and that this collapse had consequences. It was not true all the way through. However, to attempt to deny the significant policy advances made by the Bruce Golding administration of 2007 to 2011, and to advance a narrative that suggests that the world began in 2013, is to disregard the facts and not give credit where credit is due. No, I'll give you an example. Here it is. Even the claim by the opposition spokesperson on finance, that was made earlier, and it was corrected last year, and he came back and made it again, that the previous administration, or he implied it, was solely responsible for the emergence of Tax Administration Jamaica as an executive agency, ignores the stubborn fact, facts are stubborn things, that the Bruce Golding administration launched a tax reform program in 2009 that led to TAJ being established as a semi-autonomous revenue authority in May 2011, with the next step clearly articulated as becoming an executive agency. How was the social consensus of which we speak engineered, if not through the formation of a social partnership first signed in the Golding administration, which itself benefited from the kernel called ACON that sprang informally in the mid-1990s? What was the impact on the consensus that later emerged of then Prime Minister Andrew Holness in December 2011, telling a mass meeting of 20,000 or thereabouts in Mandeville Square in full glare of all media that bitter medicine would come? Once the new Prime Minister Simpson-Miller got up to speed with the reality she confronted, the wicket had been laid. The then opposition, by virtue of Prime Minister Holness's honesty and frankness, had already committed itself. And the leader of the opposition, this is where you said it, suggests that our Prime Minister was a late and reluctant participant to the consensus. Mr. Speaker, that's his exact words. I am reminded of the advice my grandmother gave me from the book of James, chapter 4, verse 7. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. Mr. Speaker, that is advice that we can all benefit from. All. The fact, Mr. Speaker, that Prime Minister Holness was at the start of the consensus, even while other elements on the opposing side were still in denial. The then opposition may have opposed certain details of the consensus, just as the current opposition is opposing our tax reductions, without recognizing that these tax reductions occur in the context of an IMF program, and the IMF staff have publicly welcomed every single one of the tax cuts in their press release of March 8th, and there's every expectation that the executive board of the IMF will give their full and complete endorsement. Does the fact that the opposition has presented weak arguments against these tax cuts, which shows a basic lack of understanding of economic realities, mean that they're against the debt reduction consensus? I would certainly hope not. I would never seek to deny the contribution of the opposition, nor the contribution of the last administration of which they are part. I believe the Prime Minister uttered similar sentences yesterday. The leader of the opposition's efforts in the previous administration with respect to fiscal consolidation, which we have continued in a new program, are noteworthy, particularly given Jamaica's history. You received the highly respected Glean Award for that. I applauded it at the time and do so now. However, Mr. Speaker, to claim paternity for every single reform is simply untrue. As for the Andrew Holness administration, here are some of the facts. First, we terminated the extended fund facility that you negotiated with the IMF 6 months after coming into office. And in its place, we negotiated a larger standby arrangement, which while focused on accelerating the downward trajectory of debt, emphasized fiscal choices that allowed for the reorienting of expenditure towards capital and social expenditure. We said as much, Mr. Speaker, in the launch of the standby agreement. You can check the press releases in November of 2016. So when you see us here talking about a 72% increase in allocations to PATH and school feeding, and a 100% increase in capital expenditure, and huge increases in security spending, we're particularly proud of this, as we set out in November 2016 to do exactly that. And the record supports this. And most importantly, Mr. Speaker, we are successfully executing on our stated plan. Another unfortunate claim from the opposition spokesman, Mr. Speaker, was that, an incredulous claim, was that the Petrocreve debt buyback is the reason that we are a year early on our 2020 debt reduction trajectory. And this claim is made without any supporting data whatsoever. Here's self-evident. You need to look no further. And if you have the humility to just listen to data, okay? You need to look no further than... Okay, you need to look no further...
Order, please.
Marky G. You need to look no further than the November 2016 agreement between the government of Jamaica and the IMF on page 28 to see that at that time, in November 2016, 1 full year after Petrocreve, the IMF and the government of Jamaica were projecting a debt to GDP ratio of 96% being attained only in March 2020. That's just a fact. It's there, page 28 in November 2016. Even after, so the fact that we attained it in March 2019 is due to many factors, including good debt liability management by the technical team. But certainly, however, the Petrocreve buyback had nothing to do with that because it happened in 2015, and any gains from that would have been included in the projections of November 2016 by the IMF and by the government of Jamaica. So when you make these claims without any support whatsoever, I'm giving you the support to say that the claims are just, vacuous. Jamaica has bettered the November 2016 IMF projections under the precautionary standby agreement, Mr. Speaker. We have lowered debt faster than the IMF projected at the start of the standby agreement in 2016, and we have achieved in March 2019 that which was originally projected to be achieved by March 2020. But the projections in November 2016 were for us to hit 96% by March 2020. Not our projections alone, the IMS projections. So the fact that we did it a year earlier is due to what happened between the time those projections were made in November 2016 and now. That's simple logic. Simple. Mr. Speaker, this administration, and I am compelled to respond to these outlandish claims of the opposition spokesman that have no support. They demand response. Mr. Speaker, this administration implemented the bold tax reform which we call direct to indirect, that among other things improved incentive to work by allowing the employee to take home all that they earned, up to $1.5 million. Development partners recommended this policy shift of broadening the base with a move to greater reliance on indirect taxes for a very long time. Direct to indirect improves the ability of government to forecast revenue with greater certainty, and it created greater horizontal equity, meaning that persons of similar income pay similar amounts in taxation, assuming consumption and income are correlated, meaning people of same income consume similarly. The then spokesman on finance, now the leader of the opposition, in his 2016 budget presentation, questioned whether the revenue estimates were the revenue estimates of that year, which incorporated direct to indirect, were contrived, and argued that government technocrats could not have computed the unrealistic numbers. See the thing from the page. His exact words were, "I dare say, given what I know of officials, I cannot believe that they would give their imprimatur to these estimates. I cannot believe that these estimates of revenue are the result of the works of officials." And the headline, that's the statement. See, right there for you to see. That was in the Jamaica Gleaner, May 18, 2016, doubting the revenue estimates. Show the headline. Imagine that, Mr. Speaker. He did not even believe the revenue estimates. Didn't believe them. Now that we have not only attained the revenue estimates, now that we have surpassed the revenue estimates, now that we have surpassed it for year 1, for year 2, for year 3, now him coming back and say, oops, it was me. It was because of what I did. Be consistent. He called the revenue estimates politically contrived. See there, May 18, 2016. And now that we're performing, now that revenue is way ahead of target, in saying it. He probably did not understand then and seems not to understand now.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order.
Order, please. Dr. Phillips.
Where
Dr. Phillips,
in the discussion
of
these estimates have I questioned the revenue estimates? If the minister should cite that, please.
My point, Mr. Speaker. My point, Mr. Speaker, is a very simple one.
Order, please.
The presentation from the opposition could have taken many different forms. There's a lot of things for them to talk about. A lot. Right?
Allow me. Mr. Speaker, with due respect, the minister is making an allegation specifically that I questioned his revenue estimates. No, we are in a debate about the we are debating this year, the estimates. Where in this debate would he cite it that I have questioned the revenue estimates? If not, the minister should withdraw the suggestion.
Mr. Speaker, I will not allow diversionary questions, which are missing the point entirely, to misdirect me. My point is, and you can't misrepresent me, I'm very clear. My point is that in 2016, when we were implementing the bold direct to indirect reforms, you questioned the revenue estimates in 2016. You called them politically contrived. You said they could not have come from technocrats. Now that we have surpassed them, now that what we said would happen has happened, in your speeches,
Mr. Speaker, I made one speech. Not two. And if the member can't cite the specific questioning of the revenue estimates in this budget, then the appropriate thing to do is to withdraw the allegation.
Mr. Speaker, no. Mr. Speaker, it is it's time that we elevate this. Dr. Clarke. The presentation.
Dr. Clarke. Order, please do not disturb the member. Dr. Clarke, please address the speaker.
The presentation of the opposition,
Order,
Mr. Speaker,
please.
is filled with references that would, in this year, filled with references that would seek to claim credit for the revenue overperformance. We hear that with our own ears. It's written in black and white. And that's what I'm alluding to.
Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Phillips, are you saying another point of order?
Yes, sir.
Could you allow state of order?
Mr. Speaker.
Go ahead, Dr. Phillips. Order, please. Go ahead, Dr. Phillips.
Mr. Speaker.
Wait, Dr. Phillips, wait. No. Dr. Phillips has a point of order. Allow him to state his point of order, and I will decide whether it's a point of order. And then Dr. Clarke will proceed to answer. Dr. Phillips. Minister. Dr. Phillips, state your point of order.
Mr. Speaker. My point of order is that the minister is not being accurate. The member makes an allegation. The member...
Dr. Phillips, address me and not them.
The member has made an allegation that I have questioned his revenue estimates in the 2019-2020
That is not what I said. Dr. Clarke, have a seat and let him, and you'll answer him.
He has put on that screen that a headline in relation to 2016, which has no bearing on anything that I said, Mr. Speaker. I value, I do not take kindly to any allegation of untruthfulness on my part. And the member has imputed that I have questioned his revenue estimates. I did no such thing, and he should withdraw. It is an entirely separate question. It is an entirely separate question if the member says that, as has been pointed out, that there were measures put in place by the previous administration which would have assisted, the collection of taxes. But to suggest that I said something which I did not is contrary to the standing orders, and the member should withdraw it.
Dr. Clarke, Dr. Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, those who have ears have heard. They heard what I said.
Yes, it's a 1.5. That's right.
Dr. Clarke. Dr. Clarke.
Mr. Speaker,
Dr. Clarke. Dr. Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, the Jamaican people can easily.
Mr. Speaker, I ask the member to withdraw.
Dr. Clarke, the Speaker would like to address you. Will you listen?
Stand or sit?
You can stand. The member is saying that your accusation on this budget is not correct.
Mr. Speaker, I said no such thing. I pointed to what he said in May 2016, and I pointed to a reference to the Jamaica Gleaner.
Order. Dr. Clarke, will somebody advise Dr. Clarke that he should pay attention to the Speaker? Dr. Clarke, you have stated that what you are saying is not this budget. Then you may proceed to satisfy him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My point, Mr. Speaker, so Mr. Speaker, the Jamaican people can see through double speaking, whoever does it.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not leaving this matter. Mr. Speaker, I am not leaving this matter. The member is either going to state clearly that he withdraws the allegation that I have lied to the Parliament, or he is going to continue in his speech and breach it.
Mr. Speaker,
members,
I think
the Prime Minister wants to make an intervention.
Mr. Speaker, it is in our interest to have this budget passed. And what we wouldn't want is for the substantial points that have to be made in the budget. So, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is contending that the Minister of Finance made a point which did not reflect his understanding of the situation. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I think the member, the Leader of the Opposition, was quite consumed on his phone when the point was being made. It could solve the issue.
Order, please.
If the minister's point could be retrieved from Hansard for the benefit of the Leader of the Opposition, after the minister's speech is made, then if it is justified, then you could rule whether or not the point made could be withdrawn. But I believe we must move on with the presentation.
Dr. Clarke, I would prefer, Mr. Phillips, have a seat. I would prefer that if you are referring to another budget, which aches the leader of the opposition, that you do not proceed on that route, that you deal with this budget and these matters. Order! 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 Dr. Clarke, you may proceed as directed by the Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my point in raising these facts is not to engage in the reverse of what the opposition has engaged in. That would be to compound their error. Unfortunately, I'm compelled to give this account due to inaccuracies in presentations by the opposition. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, highlighting the achievements, the policy achievements of the Bruce Golding administration with respect to the rehabilitation of Jamaica is not to diminish the achievements of the administration that followed. The point, Mr. Speaker, is that every success builds on an earlier achievement. Every success. Every accomplishment builds on an earlier accomplishment.
Life began in 2012, right? Yeah, man. What about the financial sector collapse?
Mr. Speaker.
What about the 18 years of wrecking the economy?
Members. Order.
All right, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that economic development of the type that we seek, it takes a village, it takes a city, it takes a country. The success of Jamaica does not belong to any one of us. It doesn't belong to any party. It belongs to the people of Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, the story is told in the first book of Kings of the two women who appeared before Solomon, both claiming to be mother of the same baby. King Solomon, in his wisdom, called for his sword and ordered that the baby be cut in two, so each of the claimants could have their part. One claimant remarked, "Your Majesty, I love the baby very much, but give him to her, don't kill him." The other, "Go ahead and cut the baby. Neither of us will have it." Mr. Speaker, we know that story and how Solomon determined that the first claimant was the true mother. With respect to the Jamaican economy, Mr. Speaker, let us, like the real mother, we say, go ahead and take all the credit. Let us just ensure that the baby is protected. We are more interested in protecting the baby than claiming credit. We are more interested in looking forward than looking backward. Right now, it is important for us, for the future, that we keep the baby and let it grow. However, Mr. Speaker, the real reason I am concerned with the inaccuracies that I quoted a while ago has very little to do with partisan politics. My concern is far deeper and far more fundamental than that. It is more about maintaining the vitality and vigilance of our liberal democracy and ensuring that this liberal democracy serves the people of Jamaica rather than only the parties which we were members. The arguments that seek to extend paternity into the future, long after you've demitted office, play into the dangerous myth of inevitability. It plays into the dangerous myth of inevitability. Mr. Speaker, nothing could so undermine our future prospects than for some of us, or a large group of us, believing that it was not inevitable it was not inevitable in 2013 that these successes would have occurred. It did not become inevitable in 2015 or in 2016, and it is still not inevitable in 2019. My fellow parliamentarians, that would be a very dangerous posture for us to adopt, and I caution against it. The forces that underestimate and cannot see ultimately defeat those who believe in the myth of inevitabilities in history. There are few, if any, inevitabilities in history. It is comforting to think that there is some inherent logic in the course of human events. When we look at events in hindsight, they provide apparent substance for this illusion. However, it was not inevitable that the last administration would have passed 10 consecutive IMF tests, even after they passed 7. It was not inevitable that the new administration would have continued with the extended fund facility and passed 3 tests under that program. It was not inevitable that the Holiness administration would have entered into its own program with the IMF and extend that relationship for a further 3 years. It was not inevitable that revenue would have overperformed for 3 consecutive years with accelerated debt paydown, allowing for tax reductions. And Mr. Speaker, the future does not hold inevitabilities for us either, irrespective of how well we have performed to date. Belief in deterministic course of events leads to complacency and ultimately to reversal and downfall. As a country, we cannot afford that. Events in human history come into being through the work and the tireless work and advocacy of men and women who remain vigilant and who commit their energies and sometimes their lives to causes that they believe in, along with luck or blessings, as I prefer to believe. Let us not play into the myth of inevitability by using deterministic arguments.
Order, please do not disturb the member. Proceed,
the opposition
Dr. Clarke.
spokesperson, Mr. Speaker, divided the $4 billion increase over 300,000 on path and then proceeded to devote several paragraphs to this erroneous calculation. The calculation demonstrates a lack of understanding of dollars versus value. When the PATH program expands school feeding to include, for the first time, children at the early childhood level, thereby increasing the likelihood of consistent school attendance at the critical early stages of life, increasing their life chances. What is the value of that service to that child? What is the value of that service to that child's family? What is the value of that service to society? Can it be measured in dollars? How do you put a value to that? When school transportation is extended to 7,500 children attending 94 schools who do not have school transportation, and now who, to the effort of this government and this budget, will have transportation and therefore attend school, what is the value of that to that child? To that child's society, to the society, to that child's family? Can it be measured in dollars? When almost 25,000 school children on PATH are now able to sit 8 CSEC subjects free of cost, up from 4, what is the value of this to the child in terms of improvement of his or her life chances? What is the value of the child to the child's family, to the society? Can it be measured in dollars? We have made substantial increases in PATH allocation because we believe that every child matters. And this administration is unapologetic about spending much more to ensure that Jamaican children are able to attend school and do well. The leader of the opposition in this budget presentation, Mr. Speaker, stated, and I quote, We can all easily agree that some work is better than no work. But when we look closely at employment numbers, what we find is that a significant part attracts very low wages related to primary, other community, social, and personal activities, like window wipers, vending, car washing. We call this a hustling sector in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, I just want to put up the following quote from Statin's Labour Force Survey in October of 2018. And let me read what it says. October 2018. It says, the occupation group professionals, senior officials, and technicians had the largest increase in employment of 7,800 between October 2018 and October 2017. Of the increase in employment in this group, females accounted for 7,600 persons. The largest change in employment by industry groups was in real estate, renting, and business activities, which increased by 9,700 persons, or 11.9%, moving from 81,700 to 91,400 in October of 2018. Mr. Speaker, that's a fact from Statin, and facts matter. Mr. Speaker, repeatedly throughout.
You're talking to yourself.
Repeatedly throughout his presentation, the opposition spokesperson referred to easing up people several times. He spoke about ease up. Mr. Speaker, we believe in empowerment. We believe in providing economic opportunity for all that empowers Jamaicans. When you apply the ease up philosophy instead of empowerment philosophy, you don't change circumstances. Instead, the MP, the big man, is still in control. We don't believe in that. We don't want to control anybody. We want to empower. Empowerment leads to permanent freedom. It leads to economic freedom. It leads to financial freedom. It leads to economic independence. Ease up that you propagate leads to economic dependence. Our first national hero, the Right Excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey, once said, God and nature first made us what we are. And then we, out of our own creative genius, we make ourselves what we want to be. Marcus then said, follow that great law. We follow that law, and we want to empower the people of Jamaica to make themselves who they want to be. That is why we found a comment of the opposition spokesperson with respect to his constituents and their housing chances so unfortunate. And many Jamaicans did as well. He may believe that, Mr. Speaker, but I do not. I believe that every Jamaican should have the ability to buy a house. And with a job, with a properly structured loan product, like what the Prime Minister spoke about yesterday, with access to cheaper financing, with a larger loan amount from the NHT, with reduced government taxes on mortgage transactions, it is becoming easier and easier to obtain home ownership. And that, Mr. Speaker, is a central objective of our budget and this administration, as the Prime Minister so eloquently explained yesterday. You remember I told you about Tracy. Tracy, I want to show Tracy's stall, and for protecting identity, that's Tracy's stall. Tracy owns her own home, that person. We, Mr. Speaker, believe in ambition and in fostering in people ambition for themselves, that they can improve their lot if given the opportunity. And we are focused on expanding that opportunity through the implementation of wide menu of policies. These include building the largest number of homes, inclusive of affordable homes, than any government in the history of Jamaica. That is our aim, and we are well on our way with 14,000 housing starts thus far, and making the largest budgetary increases to social support of any government in at least the last 12 years. By expanding the means by which children can stay in school, by conducting economic policies so as to foster an environment where jobs are being created, by unleashing the energy of micro business, small business, and medium-sized businesses, by providing them with access to finance and with business support and reducing the burden of distortionary taxation. And again, I draw on Marcus Garvey for inspiration. Garvey told his followers, many of whom were landless and jobless and educationless, let the sky and God be our limit, and eternity our measurement. There's no height to which we cannot climb, by using the active intelligence of our own minds. Mind creates, and as much as we desire in nature, we can have through the creation of our own minds. That is a message of empowerment. That is ambition right there. That is not a message of ease up. So we don't construct policy, Mr. Speaker, around the belief that residents of certain areas or from certain backgrounds can never own a house. We nurture ambition in all. We construct policy to empower home ownership, and we remove the barriers from the artificial costs associated with home ownership. Empowerment, Mr. Speaker, is about increasing knowledge and understanding in society, even if there's risk that such an increase might be to your short-term, such an increase in knowledge and understanding could be to your short-term political disadvantage. Here we have the reduction in stamp duty on transactions, and the opposition would want you to believe that only a certain segment of the society benefits. I mean, that's just untrue. The assertion is just not data-driven, and as I'll show, is factually incorrect.
What's your problem, Bobby?
As I'll share later, transaction taxes affect all who engage in transactions. Their assertion does not add to understanding. It does exactly the opposite. In Jamaica, an NHT loan is available to all contributing members of the NHT. All existing contributors are entitled to borrow from the NHT, an amount that they can afford to pay up to a maximum of $6.5 million up to April. At the lowest levels of interest, somebody can borrow $15,000. Someone has $15,000 a week can borrow $6.5 million come April at 0%, which would allow them using no more than 36% of their salary towards a home purchase. And in addition, two contributors can put together. We did not implement the policy of reducing stamp duty on property without looking on the data and seeing where and at what levels transactions are occurring in the society. Prior to the announcement of the stamp duty reduction, I examined the 2018 data on stamp duty on properties of all kinds, and I'll share some of it later. I'll share some of it right now. Mr. Speaker, over 90% of the property transactions in St. Thomas, in Clarendon, and St. Elizabeth during 2018 were under $12 million, which means you could purchase 90% of those properties in those parishes in 2018 exclusively with mortgages provided by the NHT under a joint contribution. Those are everyday Jamaicans, Mr. Speaker. No, listen. Oh, you are saying that reducing transaction taxes only affect the rich. The data doesn't support that. I am saying to you, and I am putting in the public domain. I'm putting in the public domain that 90% of the transactions, of the property transactions in St. Thomas, Clarendon, and St. Elizabeth are under $12 million. They will benefit from the stamp duty reduction on property. Mr. Speaker, over 80% of the property transactions in Portland and Manchester during 2018 were under $12 million. They will benefit from the reduction in property stamp duty. They are everyday Jamaicans. Mr. Speaker, over 70% of the property transactions across.
Do not disturb the speaker. Do not disturb the member. Do not cross talk with them, Dr. Clarke. Proceed.
There are 1.2 million.
Order from the side, please.
Mr. Speaker, over 70% of the property transactions across all parishes in all of Jamaica were under $12 million in 2018. You could purchase 70% of those properties exclusively with NHT mortgages by joint contributors. Those are everyday Jamaicans. This is Jamaica's reality. I tell you, this is Jamaica's reality. You don't understand how many people you alienate with the propaganda that only rich people benefit from lower stamp duties on property, which is out of touch with the aspirations of everyday working Jamaicans.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, I'm loath to do this, but just in the interest of accuracy, I never said that only the rich will benefit from this. I said that there is a choice being made, and it's a choice which benefits persons who are undertaking property transactions and transactions in shares, and as opposed to a choice that would benefit consumers on a daily basis. And I represent people from a section of society in the constituency where I represent, which will not be impacted by this particular measure. And the minister has not said of all these percentages around how many people are trading in land under 12 million. He hasn't said how many people benefit per year from a transaction in property and what percentage of the population that really is. So he has misquoted me. He's spinning a ball which I never spun, as if I spun it. As if I spun it. And that's a regular feature throughout his presentation today. No, propaganda.
Mr. Speaker, I am putting the data in the public domain that the reality of Jamaica is that I am not misquoting him. The rhetoric from your press conferences. Mr. Speaker, now I'm being told about rhetoric at a press conference when what was being said before was what I said in this House, which I never said. He should withdraw the remarks. Mr. Speaker, what I said about the member is, I am putting data in the public domain. 90% of
members,
90% of the property transactions in Jamaica are in the parishes of the property transaction in 2018 in the parishes of St. Thomas, Clarendon and St. Elizabeth were under 12 million. 80% in the parishes of Portland and Manchester were under 12 million. 70% in the entire Jamaica of transactions were under 12 million. That is Jamaica's reality. Mr. Speaker, no, the challenge is, Mr. Speaker,
Dr. Clarke, proceed.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, my contention is that with respect to this matter, the opposition is out of touch with the aspirations of everyday Jamaicans. Mr. Speaker, there are 1.25 million people employed in Jamaica. 1.25 approximately. And every single one of them who don't own a home, of which there are hundreds of thousands, would like at some point to own a home or buy a piece of property. Our policy simply makes this possibility a reality for more Jamaicans by removing the distortionary government taxes associated with purchasing a home. Importantly, the policy is also likely to increase the supply of these homes, as well as the NHT. The NHT alone can't build all the homes that are required. And what the understanding that's not been demonstrated is that many families, especially those from rural Jamaica, have a piece of dead left that they share with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And aside from the estate transfer tax, the cost of splitting the land up and transferring it to all members of the family has been prohibitive.
That's true.
Has been prohibitive. And so it lays undeveloped for years, even decades. Under the abolishment of ad valorem stamp duty and the lowering of transaction taxes, those with dead left that doing nothing can make something of that land. Families across Jamaica with dead left are everyday Jamaican households. And again, the opposition has missed the mark with respect to that. There's a Miss K upstairs who is such an example. A piece of land left for her and her sisters has laid unused due to high transaction taxes, which leads to immobility on a massive scale. Everyday Jamaicans. I get the letters, Mr. Speaker, you probably did in your time as well, from police officers, from tradespeople, from small operators. Recently, I received one from an unemployed young lady. Unemployed, with a dead leg. And due to her unemployed status, could not afford the transfer tax. Not the estate transfer, but after you do the estate transfer, you have to do other things. So all I want, it's okay to criticize, but don't misrepresent. We want to empower, Mr. Speaker. Okay. We want to empower all of these persons to make their own economic decisions and not to have to rely on writing to the minister for an ease up. We are offering them economic freedom and independence.
Mr. Clarke, proceed. Do not cross talk, please.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition has characterized our tax cuts as trickle-down economics. Again, this is just factually incorrect. Propaganda, plain and simple. The opposition is acting as if we're in the old days, where knowledge and information were not abundantly accessible and available, when they could attach a false label and hope that it stick. The times are changing, and they're out of touch with 20th century Jamaica. Anybody on a phone can Google the phrase trickle-down economics right now. Google it and see what it means. The claims are misleading and are therefore disempowering. There are other ways to criticize. And these false labels are factually incorrect. Google it. The opposition is not and should not be synonymous with misleading. The opposition is free to disagree, but to attach a false description, which has a precise meaning, is not. It's just not straightforward. We, Mr. Speaker, have raised income taxes on high earners making more than $6 million a year and abolish personal income taxes for those earning under $1.5 million. That is the opposite of trickle down, and you know that. You know that.
You said it wouldn't work.
This government has increased property tax rates on the highest value properties. That is the exact opposite of trickle down, and you know that. We have lowered transaction taxes for everybody. That is not trickle down, but that's what the opposition would want you to believe. So what are we? Tax cut. No way. I don't know. Mr. Speaker, I beg for your...
Dr. Clarke, address the Speaker and not those across there.
Mr.
Do
Speaker.
not cross talk. Dr. Clarke, proceed with your address to the Speaker and not
Mr. Speaker,
Mr.
We are engaged in bubbling up. Bubbling up. Bubbling up is when you empower working people and small business people with economic opportunity while protecting the vulnerable. Bubbling up is when you raise taxes on those making more than $6 million a year and you lower taxes on those making $1.5 million. Bubbling up is when you increase property taxes on the highest value properties. That is bubbling up. Mr. Speaker, bubbling up is when you abolish the minimum business tax for small operators. Bubbling up, Mr. Speaker, is when you abolish the asset tax for non-financial businesses. Mr. Speaker, bubbling up is when you raise the GCT threshold from 3 million to 10 million, cutting the administrative and operating costs of small business. The dressmaker, the the dressmaker, the tailor, the barber shop, the restaurant operator, the mechanic, the carpenter, the hairdresser, the caterer. Bubbling up. Bubbling up is when you have the first ever $200 million early stage angel fund in place for startup enterprises. Bubbling up is when you have $2 billion allocated to the SMEs, including those who don't have any collateral, to give them credit support. Bubbling up, Mr. Speaker, is when she increased the minimum wage as she did a couple months ago. That's bubbling up. And when we allocate for increase in pensions, bubbling up is when you allocate $4 billion to protect the vulnerable, $4 billion more to protect the vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, bubbling up is when you introduce for the first time in Jamaica, as the Prime Minister did, intergenerational mortgages. Mr. Speaker, and not done. Bubbling up is when you do what the Prime Minister did yesterday, which was to lower interest rates on 115,000 contributors or borrowers from the NHT. Bubbling up is when you reduce student loan interest rates, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, bubbling up is when you reduce property transaction taxes, and over 70% of property transactions can be bought with joint NHT mortgage. A piece of land, a subdivision, a little house. Mr. Speaker, bubbling up is when you reduce the transaction taxes on registering land for people, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Do not disturb the member.
Mr. Speaker,
order, please.
Some people only believe in babbling up. We're bubbling up. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker,
do not disturb the member. Address the Speaker, Dr. Clarke. Not crosstalk, please.
Mr. Speaker, the banking market that we have today Mr. Speaker, the banking market that we have today arose out of our history. The history of the last 25 years in particular shaped the market today, which is just what it is. A few players have large market share. We have to design policy to suit our circumstances. We want and we need competition in financial services that deliver the best prices to customers and that facilitate economic activity and growth. One thing that can really stir competition and help with interest rate reductions being passed on to customers is by obliterating the cost of switching financial providers. And that is what the abolishment of ad valorem stamp duty on transaction documentations will achieve. No, obliteration, bring it down to $5,000. is 0.625 for mortgages, is 4% on receivables, is 1.8% of bill of sale, up to if it's refinanced to the level of what it was before. This is obliterating. That is what the abolishment of ad valorem stamp duty does. No longer will the government stand in your way when you want to switch and access lower cost solutions. We are empowering you to move your business if you have a better deal. This gives economic independence and financial freedom. I was speaking recently to a head of one financial institution after the announcement, and I'm told that the banks are protecting their client base from poaching by offering their customers already improved interest rates and terms so they don't think of moving. This, Mr. Speaker, is economic opportunity in action. I noted with interest, Mr. Speaker, an advertisement in from a prominent financial institution in today's newspaper announcing a reduction in their mortgage rate to 6.99%. Others will simply follow suit. Reducing transaction taxes or abolishing ad valorem transaction taxes on financial transactions and on the perfecting of security delivers financial relief to consumers. That is how good economic policy creates economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, the government of Jamaica, like all other governments, relies on a menu of taxation to raise revenue to conduct the business of the state. However, not all taxes have the same effect on income and choices. Some taxes have a material impact on economic activity or the absence of it. Efficient taxes are those that raise revenues with the least amount of distortion on the behavior of individuals and businesses. If the same revenue raised with less damage to the economy as a whole, then Jamaica will be better off. And simplicity and fairness are other considerations as well. We raise taxes on high-income earners, much to the displeasure of many, in order to ensure some amount of fairness. And we began this quest for efficient taxation with the switch from direct to indirect, which has improved revenue certainty and helped to usher in, not exclusively, but helped to usher in this period of 3 consecutive years of overperformance. Direct to indirect achieves efficiency through a broadening of the tax base, ensure that not only those on PAYE pay, but all who consume pay. And it, therefore, as I mentioned earlier, introduces horizontal equity. Since government, if it is to exist, must impose taxes, then good tax policy, ideal tax policy, taxes goods and services that are least elastic to price changes, i.e. the behavior of the taxpayer is not changed by the fact that the activity attracts taxes. People still engage in the same patterns of investment and consumption. Now, as a simple fact, of all factors of production, land, labor, capital is the most mobile. Whether the capital is in financial institutions that provide the nurse with a mortgage, or the capital is the small credit union savings of the hotel worker, or the small business, or the large business. Irrespective of ownership, capital is largely mobile and therefore elastic to price changes. Stamp duties therefore distort economic activity because Ms. Kay, who I spoke about earlier and who is in this audience, delays and has delayed for many years the decision to split the dead left land so that all of the siblings can have their own title and proceed to do something with it. The NHT contributing security guard who has his eye on an affordable home, even though the mortgage financing exists and it equates to the value of his rent, because of the transaction taxes, which for a $5 million home would be $150,000, he delays his purchases. The small business hesitates to switch financial providers for one offering at a lower rate because of the transaction cost of switching. On an economy-wide basis, high ad valorem stamp duties affect the decision to transact, affect the allocation of capital on a grand scale, and results in misallocation as to where things are taxed later. Several years ago, while I was still in the private sector, I met a hotel employee at a hotel in Washington, D.C., who serviced the minibars. No, listen to this. No, seriously. We want to move forward as a country. Just listen to this for a second. Who serviced the minibars on the top floors. She happened to be Jamaican, and I struck up a conversation with her. She eventually told me that over the course... that over the course of many years, she and her husband did quite well. So much so that they own 2 homes in Florida. I asked her, why not Jamaica? And she told me transaction taxes were too high. We want all members of the diaspora to consider Jamaica among the options for purchasing homes. And previously, high stamp duties have distorted this kind of activity. And Mr. Speaker, the high property transaction taxes have a higher impact on lower income earners than it does on higher income earners as a percentage of their income. So, Mr. Speaker, the lowering of, and here I'm just speaking of the property side of it, property transaction taxes will usher in an unprecedented period of opportunity as lower transaction taxes on property take hold. Plumbers and carpenters and masons and furniture makers and retailers and others will find even more opportunity than exists today, including the opportunity to buy their home. In addition, lower property transaction taxes will increase labor mobility, you're listening? Good. Make downsizing and upsizing according to the life cycle associated with family expansion and later aging more attractive, allowing for more efficient allocation of resources. Lower property transaction taxes will lead to greater turnover of property, greater supply of affordable homes, and therefore greater access to home ownership. Lower property transaction taxes will lead to more work, as I mentioned earlier, for masons and carpenters, plumbers, electricians, welders, and furniture makers. In addition, the construction buoyancy, which is only expected to increase with these changes, is already having an impact on the wages of masons, electricians, plumbers, and painters. In fact, the Statin Consumer Price Index from March 2019, and I don't think I have it on the slide, but you should check it out. It's there. The exact quote is there. This is March 2019. It says that while in the housing, water, electricity, gas sector, prices declined by 2.5% due to reduced electricity, water, and sewage rates, these decreases were moderated by a 2.4% increase in maintenance and repair of the dwelling, due mainly to an increase in wages for masons, electricians, plumbers, painters, and carpenters. And this hasn't even taken effect yet. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've heard the opposition's call for GCT to be reduced. Mr. Speaker, we have been at this trajectory before, this point in our debt trajectory before, with a debt to GDP ratio of 96%. The last time we had this level of debt to GDP, I'll just remind, was in 2000-2001. And at that time, just as a matter of fact, and you were a senior cabinet minister at the time, just as a matter of fact, we never had any suggestions at that time from anybody in government or otherwise to reduce the rates of GCT or SET or to reduce any taxes at all. In fact, when we were last at 96% debt to GDP, the then government raised taxes by imposing $26 billion of taxes over the 4 years. $3.8 billion in that year and $26 billion in the 4 years that followed. Just a historical fact. We are again at 96% debt to GDP, and this government has implemented the first net tax reduction in Jamaica in living memory. Let me return to the GCT, Mr. Speaker. Reduction of GCT was considered, but analysis suggests that this would have less of an impact on the Jamaican economy than removing distortionary transaction taxes for the following reasons. First, Mr. Speaker, GCT is charged on both local and imported items. Both local and imported items. And it is Jamaica's single largest source of tax when you combine local and imported. We are projected to collect about $200 billion of GCT, the largest single source. With a debt level of 96%, Jamaica remains among the top 25 or top 30 highest indebted countries in the world, and therefore very vulnerable to external shocks. And in that position of vulnerability, you don't start the tax reduction journey with reducing your biggest source of tax, as it is too risky to do so. The second related reason, Mr. Speaker, is at this time, when we are at 96% debt to GDP, is that GCT is a much more robust and reliable tax. And God forbid, if there were any economic downturn, that the property transactions fall faster than overall GCT, as those decisions are easier to delay. And ad valorem yields fall faster. So therefore, the ad valorem stamp duties are more fickle, and the data suggests that as well, and therefore sensitive to overall economic health. Then, therefore, when you're heavily indebted, it's far less risky to reduce your taxes that are fickle than reducing your taxes that are more robust. The third reason, Mr. Speaker, is that in a year where we are abolishing minimum business tax for small business, abolishing asset tax for small business, raising the GCT threshold, and reducing financial transaction taxes by applying some of the space to a GCT reduction, would be negligible in the context of approximately a $200 billion intake. The effect will be negligible. So allow me. So if you did all of those and you applied some balance to the GCT, what we're saying is that the impact on the consumer, when you consider it's $200 billion overall, would be very small. And the reduction would not, allow me to finish. No, and the reduction would not be meaningful. It could make it, could be popular, it could make one feel good, but it wouldn't be impactful. And such a small change, let me finish. Such a small, because the percentage change would be small, it could easily be reclaimed by businesses and prices adjust over time and the consumer not benefit. Instead, we have chosen to remove distortionary taxes where we can make more meaningful, bolder, impactful reductions that won't get lost, but will have a decisive catalytical impact on transaction and economic activity. The fourth reason, Mr. Speaker, and a very important reason, is that almost half of our GCT intake comes through GCT on imported items. Reducing the GCT, therefore, Mr. Speaker, at a time that we're at 96%, would be to be passing more than we would want of our tax cut stimulus to overseas economies. And at a time of 96% debt to GDP, that would just be bad economic policy. Mr. Speaker, on SET, it's similar. It was considered, but the analysis suggests it would have less of an impact on the economy than removing distortionary transaction taxes. We consider the reduction of distortionary transaction taxes at this time to be better for the Jamaican economy overall. Mr. Speaker, any commodity that you reduce the price of by an appreciable degree, among other things, I'm not saying this is the only effect, but among other things, you encourage more consumption of that item. And at a time when we're in the top 25 most indebted countries in the world, making every attempt to grow, we do not need to encourage more consumption of imported petroleum. Again, we would be directing a stimulus to other oil-producing economies. The objective of this government is to help Jamaicans in a fair, equitable, but also a sustainable manner. Now, Mr. Speaker, the opposition spokesperson made some points that I am going to take on. He made the point that given the current ad valorem stamp duty rate on using primary property as security for a loan, given that it's 0.625%, then if you use that if you use such a title to get a loan of $150,000 was the example that he used, you would pay $937 today. And to apply a flat rate of $5,000 in that specific example would represent an increase. And while every single transaction will be like this, for one or two people it would be, and therefore it's worthy of addressing. For it will be. Ad valorem duty, just because people don't use a title, title is likely to be highly valued, and people hardly use things that are valued in the millions for a very small loan. Ad valorem stamp duty, ad valorem stamp duty payable on any instrument pursuant to the Stamp Duty Act will be replaced with a flat stamp duty of $100 per document or parcel related to transactions valued below $500,000 and $5,000 per document related to transactions valued at $500,000 and more. To be clear, Mr. Speaker, the ad valorem calculation for betting, gaming, and lottery tickets remains unchanged. The opposition spokesman also raised the point that the current GCT Act requires all persons or entities below the threshold as it exists now of $3 million to deregister. And if we raise the threshold to $10 million, then this clause would mean that all persons, entities below $10 million would be required by law to deregister. And while the freedom from the burdens of filing benefit the overwhelming majority of businesses with sales less than $10 million, there will be some who may prefer to remain registered. And this is a feature today. And I don't want, today on the threshold is $3 million, and the law requires all people under $3 million to not be registered. Even though that is a law, it came into effect after lots of people with sales under $3 million were registered, and they have not all been deregistered. So that was something that is known, and therefore a point that is worthy of acceptance. We'll therefore reinstate the provision in the GCT Act which empowers the Commissioner to re-register an applicant under the voluntary registration regime should that be the preference of the business. The Commissioner will retain the Commissioner will retain the discretion to refuse such a registration because there are instances where this can be abused, and where there's evidence of abuse, then he would not. Yeah. So So I said it at the beginning. All other aspects of the GCT, regime will remain in force. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is a country of ambitious people, all trying to get ahead. From the church sister who sews on the side, to the teacher who provides extra lessons on weekends as a business, to the nurse who bakes and sells. We all want better for our own lives, for our families, and for our children. And we all want to get ahead, and rightly so. This government has prepared a historic budget that is focused on empowering every Jamaican, providing them with greater economic freedom, greater opportunity, greater independence, while protecting the most vulnerable in our society, especially our young people. We have increased our capital expenditures as an investment in future growth, and we have allocated the largest part of that expenditure to ensuring that we provide our security forces with the resources and tools necessary to reduce crime and provide a safer society. We have reduced distortionary taxes to ease the yoke of taxation that has strangled so many businesses and individuals in our society for so long, and in so doing have provided a further mechanism through which to stimulate economic growth and prosperity. We have given credit where credit is due. We have corrected the record to ensure accuracy and fairness, and accepted the constructive suggestions for improvement offered by the opposition. We want and expect that economic growth and prosperity will bubble up in our society. bubble up in our society, Mr. Speaker. We are moving in the right direction, Mr. Speaker, and we fully intend to continue to build on these achievements as we seek to build a society that promotes growth with equity. Let me end with the words of Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Ambition is the desire to go forward and improve one's condition. It is a burning flame that lights up the life of the individual and makes him see himself or herself in another state. To be ambitious is to be great in mind and soul, to want that which is worthwhile and to strive for it, to go on without looking back, reaching to that which gives satisfaction. Lift up yourselves, take yourselves out of the mire, and hit your hopes to the very star themselves. Mr. Speaker, we are moving in the right direction with growth and equity. Thank you, and God bless Jamaica.
Dr. Clarke. Dr. Clarke. Dr. Clarke, you have to now ask for the second reading.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for a second reading of the bill, the Appropriation Act.
The question is, order, member, order. The question is that the bill be read a second time. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Apply a Sum out of the Consolidated Fund to the service of the year ending on the 31st day of March 2020 and to appropriate the sums granted in this session of Parliament, read a second time.
Members, the House will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the bill clause by clause. Members, I put clause 1. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it. I put clause 2. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it. I put clause 3. Is there amendment?
Mr. Speaker, do I address the schedules at this stage or wait until the schedule come after? Okay.
What on? What on?
Put clause 3, please.
I put clause 3. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. I put the schedule. Those in favor?
Mr. Speaker, there is a transposition error on page 7. There's a typographical error. Page 7, column 3, and I believe it would be the number that is 338628.0. It should be 338682.0. And I ask, given that this is a typographical error, that the committee make note of it and that the change be read in or accepted.
I put the amendment. Those in favor?
No, it's typo. It's a typo. Yes. Okay. I put the schedule.
I understand that it's a typographical correction, okay? So I put the schedule. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. The question is that I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Members, I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment. Those in favour? Those against? The ayes have it. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I now propose a third reading of the bill.
The question is that the bill be read a third time. Those in favour? Those against? The ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Apply a Sum out of the Consolidated Fund to the service of the year ending on the 31st day of March 2020 and to appropriate the sums granted in this session of Parliament, read a third time and passed.
Mr. Semuda.
Mr. Speaker, it is I cannot recall a budget debate that has ended in such a jolly and bubbling way. We have had a bubbling debate. But notwithstanding that, Mr. Speaker, all good things come to an end. And we have concluded this appropriations bill debate in fine fashion. Well constituted. The contributions from the opposition were constructive, at times destructive. The contributions from the government had its great strength, especially that of our Prime Minister that spoke yesterday. Our Minister of Finance has unearthed a personality that we did not realize existed in that frail body, relatively frail body. But he has certainly mushroomed into quite an outstanding figure and a good public speaker, and I commend him for that. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I move that the sitting be adjourned until next Tuesday at 2 p.m. That's Tuesday the 26th of March. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have to adjourn until next Tuesday, Mr. Speaker. I see some expressions of concern because it was not intended, but we have a supplementary to approve, and that can only be done before the end of March. So we must convene next Tuesday. I'm sorry to disappoint you all who had plans of going off into the hills of some place, but that is what it is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, on this notice of adjournment, I wish to bring to the attention of the House a matter of national importance. And I will put the motion I wish to present and also take my 3 minutes in my presentation of it. And it's briefly, Mr. Speaker, whereas the Prime Minister has requested and today received the resignation of the Minister of Education and has not given the reason for so doing, and whereas the Ministry of Education is responsible for critical aspects of national affairs, especially the education of our children, and including the imminent holding of the new PEP examinations, be it resolved that the Parliament calls on the Prime Minister to inform the Parliament of the reasons for requesting the Minister's resignation, and this Parliament also calls on the Prime Minister to urgently appoint a Minister of Education to handle the affairs of that important ministry. But, Mr. Speaker, in the terms of the motion put, I think the Jamaican people do expect...
Mr. Fowler,
yes.
Before you proceed to debate the motion, we must come to some understanding. The motion that you are putting on the floor for the adjournment will have the following order.
Pardon?
3 members will speak. Have a seat. On the motion for not more than 3 minutes allotted to each speaker. 2 from that side and 1 from this side. I am going to ask, do not embarrass me to knock more than once. We will time for each side speaking, and you may now proceed, Mr. Paulwell. It's now 3 minutes after 5.
Mr. Speaker, we are agreed long before now that that would be the course. Mr. Speaker, we were expecting, because of the importance of this matter, that there would have been a statement earlier by the Prime Minister, who is reported in the media as having taken control of the Ministry of Education. Now, it is clear to all of us that education is a most important function of the government, and especially at this time when there is so much anticipation, so much concern, so much upheaval in relation to our young children, who I gather next week ought to be sitting the PEP examination. Already there are calls coming to me as Member of Parliament from parents as to whether or not this is going to create the opportunity for a postponement of the elections, whether or not this will disturb the rhythm of the ministry. And Mr. Speaker, I have 3 minutes. I have 3 minutes.
Order, please.
I have 3 minutes. And Mr. Speaker, we are very concerned about that aspect. But education is much bigger than PEP. And so you have a large family in the education system that will be very concerned at this time. We're also concerned, Mr. Speaker, because in the announcement of the Prime Minister that the ministry will now be located at OPM, again, it adds to the matters that that ministry has to handle. And I dare say that this would be a step in the wrong direction for that significant portfolio to be attached to the office of the Prime Minister. So, Mr. Speaker, that is crucial. There's also an institution called the Caribbean Maritime University, which is a fledgling university that seems to be at the center of this episode, and it is therefore important for some clarity to be given. There are students who are enrolled there who are very concerned and worried about the latest developments, and we urge, therefore, that some definitive statement be given today, and for it to be followed up hopefully by the time we meet next week in relation to this serious matter affecting the Ministry of Education and the Caribbean Maritime University.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Well, you stay within your time.
Mr. Speaker, two matters arise in addition to what has been already raised by the Leader of Opposition Business. First is that in view of what I would call the hasty resignation, certainly unanticipated resignation of the minister, there would seem to be very grave matters involved. The Prime Minister's statement that was published earlier gives no indication as to the specific causes that triggered in the Prime Minister's mind the need for such an immediate action on the part of the minister. And in view of the fact that it is a minister who had stewardship of one of the larger ministries, and certainly a ministry central to the developmental needs of the country, we would ask the Prime Minister if he would give some indication as to the causes for such immediate action as far as he was concerned. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, the Constitution requires in Section 71, Section 69, when on matters of law, I rely on you. All right. Thankfully, not very often. But, Mr. Speaker, the Constitution requires that not less than 2 nor more than 4 ministers be chosen from the Senate. In view of the current resignation, there would, I believe, that there is need for an appointment not just to the Senate, but from the Senate to the Cabinet. And in view of that, and in view of other considerations, such as the centrality, the very centrality of the Ministry of Education, would want to indicate here that we have strong objection on this side, despite the fact that it is the prerogative of the Prime Minister, to the Ministry of Education not having a minister directly responsible for that ministry. We think it is of the utmost importance, and we would urge the Prime Minister to take note of those considerations and to take it into his consideration as he undertakes his actions. This is a very serious matter which points again to the urgent needs of good governance and to the elimination of all corrupt practices from government. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we welcome the questions raised by the opposition. It is important that the country is assured that the government is serious about dealing with issues having to do with the good governance of their affairs, allegations of corruption, malfeasance, maladministration, and that we set a standard of accountability that cannot be questioned. Issues have been raised in the public domain which have caused me to have a conversation with the minister. After that conversation, it appeared to me that given, as the leader of the opposition has said, the sensitivity of the Ministry of Education, that the best thing to do would be for the minister to tender his resignation so that the processes that have been established, and let me be clear that Jamaica, as pointed out by the Minister of Finance, is a liberal democracy. And you pointed out the frequency of elections, freedom of press, and the independent judiciary. But another feature of that democracy is the growing establishment of independent authorities to deal with matters such as corruption and the preservation of the integrity of the state. Those agencies, commissions, organizations are in action. They are doing what is necessary and investigating. Our job now as the administration is to ensure that there is no impediment and there is no obstruction and that there is transparency. I believe that the action taken today by myself and the minister would strengthen the system of our democracy so that there is transparency. We have learned. There is no question Jamaica is evolving and the government is evolving, and this is the standard. Mr. Speaker, as it relates to the other issue raised by the leader of the opposition, which is how will the ministry be managed? Part of the role of the office of the Prime Minister is to make sure that every ministry is being run properly. How I view my job is from the point of view of ensuring that the principles of good governance are institutionalized in every ministry. So once I see that there is a problem that signals a governance issue, a breakdown in supervision and oversight by the minister, then I have to intervene and ensure that those problems are not systemic or deep-rooted. And if they are, to correct them. That is what I did with Petrojam and the Ministry of Energy. So my first step, leader of the opposition, is to ask the permanent secretary to give me a full report of the functioning of the ministry. That has already been, that instruction has already been issued. I have assigned earlier today Minister Samuda to go over to the Ministry of Education and to assist in... Yes, Minister Samuda is assigned.
Order, please.
I have 3 minutes, Mr. Speaker. Bear in mind they have taken 30 seconds. No, but the point is, Mr. Speaker, that my office will undertake a review of the Ministry of Education. We don't expect to be doing that review for more than a month or two. It's a large ministry, and we will do a full review of the ministry. In the interim, the other point raised by the leader of the opposition, a constitutional point as to whether or not the cabinet is now properly constituted, bearing in mind that a minister who was from the Senate has resigned. I suspect that I will have the judgment of whether or not my actions are constitutional would depend on the speed at which I act, because clearly the law would have to contemplate intervening events that would determine how fast I could make an appointment, such as appointing someone to the Senate, identifying a minister. So there would be some reasonable time. There's some reason. Whatever is considered reasonable, a court will decide, but it's not something that immediately makes the cabinet unconstitutional. No, the budget is passed not by the cabinet. The budget is passed by the parliament. Yeah. No, but even so, the budget is passed by the parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, the considerations that are raised are valid considerations. I wish to assure the public that the Ministry of Education has a very strong bureaucracy. That it has a very strong bureaucracy, not in the negative sense, but it has a very strong public administration culture. And therefore, the operations will continue unimpeded, and I am expecting that the new exams, the PEP, will go off without any difficulty. I will receive a report tomorrow, specifically on that, as to the preparations and how those are going. I leave the island tomorrow, and I return on Sunday. By then, Mr. Speaker, I should be able to make an appointment to the Senate and fill the constitutionally required position in the Cabinet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The motion is that the House be adjourned until Tuesday, the 26th. Those in favor? Those against? As of it.